Welcome back, AP. It's chapter 14 from the American Pageant, falling into the category of period 4. And chapter 14 is titled Forging the National Economy. Some of the key terms that you need to be familiar with, as well as the people to know. Industrialization. All of the following gave rise to a more dynamic, market-oriented national economy in the early 19th century America. So you have the push into the Western territories in the promise of cheaper land. There was a vast number of European immigrants settling in cities, which provided a large workforce for industrialization. Newly invented machinery made industrialization possible and to produce a product in a more efficient manner. And then better roads, faster steamboats, further reaching canals, and the beginning of the railroads connected the north, south, and the western areas and made the transportation of goods more efficient. The frontier is those western territories in the plains areas of the United States. Life on the frontier was grim for most pioneer families. A lot of loneliness haunting them because they're so isolated and cut off. And this was especially true of women whose only contact might be their children. Pioneers, as they were called, felt isolated and they called upon government for help in building internal improvements. So, roads, railroads, to connect those frontier areas or the western territories with the rest of the United States. Although life on the frontier was difficult, many like George Catlin believed in preserving nature as a national policy. His idea created the national park system, like Yellowstone National Park, which was established in 1872. Rapid urbanization also is a product of industrialization, and what rapid urbanization means is the quick growth of cities. In the early 19th century America, the urban population was growing at an unprecedented rate. It was doubling approximately every 25 years. In the year 1790, New York and Philadelphia were the only cities that had a population of over 20,000 people. By 1860, there were 43 cities with population over 20,000. Rapid urbanization had a lot of problems, though. It resulted in unsanitary conditions in a lot of the communities. And by unsanitary, I mean no garbage pickup, no waste removal, things of that nature, which would make the cities an unsavory place to be living in. Immigration, the potato famine in the 1840s, which was what the population of Ireland depended on as their main food source, resulted in millions of Irish immigration to the United States. When the potato rot hit the crops, about a quarter of the population, which was 2 million, died of starvation and disease. The Black 40s, as they were called, led to a mass exodus of people from Ireland. Ireland's greatest export was its population. The large influx of Catholic Irish who continued to hate the British led many of them to be mistreated by native workers. And by native workers, I mean workers who were born in the United States. Because of the large influx of Irish immigration to the United States, NINA, which meant no Irish need apply, was a common sign posted at a lot of factory gates. When the Irish flocked to the U.S. in the 1840s, they stayed mostly on the eastern seaboard cities because they were too poor to move further west and buy up land in the western territories. When the famine Irish came to America, they mostly remained in the port cities of the Northeast. Boston and New York became the largest Irish cities. German immigration. Germans immigrated to the U.S. in the early 19th century, and they tended to preserve their own language and their own culture. German immigrants to the United States came to escape economic hardships and an autocratic government in Germany. The Germans contributed the Conestoga wagon, the Christmas tree, beer, and kindergarten to American culture. Some backlash because of the increase of immigration to the U.S. Those who were frightened by the rapid influx of Irish immigrants organized the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. It was an oath-bound secret society in New York, which was created in 1849 by Charles Allen, and it was in protest of the rise of Irish, Catholic, and German immigration to the U.S. The sentiment of fear and opposition to open immigration is known as nativism. Native-born Americans feared that Catholic immigrants to the U.S. would establish the Catholic Church at the expense of Protestantism. However, immigrants coming to the U.S. before 1860 helped to fuel economic expansion. So they are the driving force behind the industrialization that's taking place in the U.S. and that expansion of the money made from that, which contributes to the economy. Some inventions that also help during industrialization. The father of the factory system in the U.S. was Samuel Slater. He memorized plans for the machinery that spins cotton thread and escaped to the U.S. Eli Whitney was instrumental in the invention of the cotton gin. As a result of the development of the cotton gin, slavery was revived in the South and expanded further. Eli Whitney also introduced the method of mass production of muskets for the U.S. Army, which was based on the principle of interchangeable parts. Between 1790 and 1800, there were only 306 patents issued in the U.S., and between 1850 and 1860, 28,000 were issued. Samuel F.B. Morse strung 40-mile wire from Washington to Baltimore and tapped out the historic message, "What hath God wrought?" And this is the telegraph improving the business world as well as the communication with the frontier. Those who worked in factories and in the industrial northern cities were known as wage slaves. The early factory system distributed its benefits mostly to the owners. While the owners grew rich, working people wasted away. Children were also exploited as a cheap source of labor. The American workforce in the early 19th century was characterized by substantial employment of women and children in factories. Because of the poor working conditions, labor unions are formed between the 1830s and 40s, and because of the labor unions and the banding together of the workers, many strikes took place to ask for 10-hour work days. Many workers realized that their strongest weapon was to lay down their tools and go on strike, which is refusing to work. In the case of Commonwealth versus Hunt, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts ruled that labor unions were not illegal conspiracies. Women in the economy. The vast majority of working women were single. Upon marriage, they left their paying jobs and took up the job of wives and mothers. It's known as the cult of domesticity, which glorified the traditional role of women as the homemakers. Women's changing roles and the Industrial Revolution changed life in the 19th century home. Families were getting smaller, and one of the goals is to have child-centered families where they're raising their children to be independent, contributing individuals. The effect of early 19th century industrialization on the West was to encourage specialized cash crop agriculture. The development of cash crop agriculture in the West meant that farmers had to take out loans, which also meant that they were in a large amount of debt. Inventions like the steel plow and McCormick's mechanical reaper gave way to large-scale farming and more debt because farmers would have to purchase the equipment, which was expensive, and in order to do that, they would have to borrow more money from the banks. Before the annual harvest could move east or west, major transportation innovation had to be made. In the 1790s, a major transportation project linked the east to the west, and it was the Lancaster Turnpike. The federal government constructed the National Road, also known as Cumberland Road. Western road building faced all of the following problems. It was expensive. It ran into opposition with states' rights activists. Eastern states were opposed to it, and there were interruptions of war, for example, the War of 1812. The canal era of American history began with the construction of the Erie Canal in New York. The construction of the Erie Canal forced some New England farmers to move or change occupations. The most significant contribution to the development of the economy was the railroads. There were some early setbacks. Gauges, which is the distance between the rails, brakes weren't working well and they were dangerous. Eventually, the railroads, or the iron horse, was made of steel. The revolution in transportation connected the U.S. and helped boost the national economy. Finally, the market revolution transformed subsistence economy into a national network of industry and commerce. It paved the way for monopolies, and it became dependent on the abundance of immigrant labor. And the market revolution is that transition from families making things or growing things that they need for sustaining their way of life to purchasing what they need, and changing the whole idea of how America and business in America and the economy was run.